This episode is sponsored by Magic Mind and Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled, Is Vanilla Tech Just for Juniors? Exploring the role of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in 2024. Now, what we're going to talk about here, I mean, the title certainly suggests it, but we're going to be talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because there's sort of like, I mean, this has been brewing and it kind of has existed for a while, but Mike recently had an episode that he wrote up here a couple weeks ago, and I'm going to mention it in the actual episode, but it's like, why is web development such a cluster F? And basically, that episode left me with some impressions about vanilla, but then I just recently did a rather large project with vanilla, or a rather large like section of a page with vanilla, and I was on the phone with you, actually, Mike, and we had a discussion over like how much more difficult it was, or, you know, whatever, or whether it was feasible to do it, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to have that discussion, because as things get abstracted with plugins and libraries, and frameworks, and all the rest of the stuff, you know, you can call it progress, you can call it whatever you want, but it's kind of separating the developer, in my opinion, a little bit from the vanilla experience. So we're going to discuss that today. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Now, I'm going to use the term vanilla tech a bunch. There's also vanilla tech used in the title. And, you know, so what is vanilla tech? I've already kind of mentioned that. Vanilla tech is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or JS. HTML is the skeleton of your web page, effectively. It's kind of like the framework where you say this, you know, this area here is my navigation bar. This area here is my content boxes. This is my footer. This is like the main body of my blog, those type of things. So it's very abstract. You're not setting any colors. You're not setting really any widths and things like that. I mean, you can do it in line, but just in general, sort of speaking, HTML is, you know, more or less your skeleton. And you leave the styling and the layouts more or less to CSS, which effectively, quote unquote, attaches itself to the HTML. And it'll say, hey, that header needs to be 100% width. It needs to be, you know, 400 pixels tall. When the screen gets smaller, it becomes shorter or longer, or whatever it is you want to do. You set your colors and all those type of things in your CSS, or CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So your CSS is where all your styling is done, of course. And then you have JavaScript, of course, or JS, and that's where you do your interactivity. That's more or less where that goes. And you can do things like, oh, when this button is clicked, you know, turn the page up on its head, make the whole page disappear, move things around, left, right, center, you know, detect inputs, validate forms. You can do that as well with JS. And I want to be clear here as well, for the sake of this episode, because I know some of you are going to be like, hey, you know, JavaScript is, you know, can do more. It can go on the back end. It can be used on the back end, things like that. And in this episode, I don't want to talk, I don't really want to, like, we'll probably touch on it here and there. I don't want to talk about that really that much. What I want to focus on primarily is these sort of vanilla technologies in their most vanilla form, meaning like a static page. Just think of them as front-end vanilla technologies, right? I'm not using my JavaScript to tell the server to do something or whatever. I'm thinking about this in sort of like what I would call maybe the simplest or the most pure form, which is, you know, someone has maybe their index.html, and then that's where their homepage is at. And at most, they have three files. They have an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JS file, or maybe it's all just in one file, right? So just like a static page, a static site. These are just vanilla front-end technologies for the sake of this episode, because, again, I want to talk about whether these things are just sort of a learning tool these days. Back when, I mean, Mike and I were in high school, we learned programming not on the latest thing. We weren't like programming like PS2 games or PS3 games or whatever. We weren't doing that. We were learning, at least I did, I was learning QBasic and BASIC, which is, super, super old. I think it was, copyright 70s or 80s or something from memory. The UI looks really rough. It's really old. That's what we were learning. And then we weren't necessarily going to be using that in real world apps. It's not like we made real world apps with things like that. We use those technologies to understand computer logic, understand conditional statements and sort of basic programming concepts. And then you were supposed to kind of go and learn syntax of a more modern language if you wanted to continue with the topic. And so that more or less encompasses what this episode is about is, have these vanilla technologies become sort of the QBasic of my high school era type thing.
Before we jump right into it, I just want to kind of touch on one little thing. HTML, 100% traditionally just your kind of skeleton code and stuff like that. Something that's been happening slowly over time, though, is that HTML has gotten some interactivity inside of it. So I want to kind of start propagating that a little bit, because rather than just forcing everything to be JavaScript, if HTML already has it built in, there's no reason to. For example, a input field can have a data set, a data attribute on it that will allow it to be autocomplete by automatically by just adding some HTML tags, right? Like there's autocomplete built into HTML. So for a very simple input field, you don't need JavaScript to do autocomplete, which is really cool. There's obviously like the form landscape in HTML, being able to actually send like a server request through a form and, submit stuff in and validate it and all that through HTML is another whole thing that you can do that's outside of like the skeleton structure of it. There's a bunch of like little things that you can look up. Maybe I'll have a article in the show notes showing all the little HTML things that you can do that aren't traditional skeleton stuff. And maybe even Matt, we can write an article for HTML things to explore that, because I feel like, yes, again, traditionally and like moving forward, even the majority of HTML's purpose is to just kind of put the structure to the page, the visual structure to the page. But as HTML expands as a language, as it evolves, there's no reason not to use those things, because they're going to perform better than JavaScript. They're going to be better for accessibility because, again, they're built into the browser. The browser can natively know what the heck's going on if you use them properly. So it's kind of better to lean towards things that are given to you rather than, recreate the wheel each time.
Well, it's kind of the same thing when we were in college, Mike. Like we've brought this up a few times on the show, where one of the things that we learned was embedded programming, and embedded programming is pretty close to what they call the metal, meaning pretty close to the actual chip. If you think about it, like a circuit board has, little chips, little integrated circuits on there. And those integrated circuits will, sort of make very simple decisions. Like, hey, if, someone presses a button and, 5 volts becomes active on like the pin on the top left, make the pin in the bottom right also light up, because it's, you're turning on the light and there's 2 lights on this thing. That's a very basic example, but you're very close to that. You don't have Windows running on this chip, is basically what I'm saying. You don't have, Windows running on this chip, and then I've made an app that goes through the browser. It's actually PWA. Like, those abstraction layers don't exist close to the metal. So for web development, that close to the metal sort of experience is more or less vanilla tech, really. I know there's WebAssembly, stuff like that, blah, blah, blah. But again, for the sake of this episode, what we're really talking about, the metal, instead of it being the actual circuit board, it would be the browser. And the browser, it runs vanilla tech. And that's what I want to talk about now, is that vanilla tech is kind of like, I want to say it's a hot button issue, but it's not like, an amazingly like viral, everyone's totally freaking out, or it's controversial or whatever. Like, I haven't seen that. I've definitely seen people argue about stuff, and that's why I would call it hot button, because people definitely have their opinions in this sort of space, in this area of our industry. And the statement I want to make, and I think you actually made this maybe on an episode from a while ago, Mike, is that vanilla tech still, quote unquote, runs the web. We, meaning humans, interact with websites in an almost entirely GUI manner, meaning, graphical user interface. And even accessibility tools for those with eyesight impairments interpret the GUI in various ways, and those tools translate the GUI or the visual experience usually to audio. It's translating it from the visual sense to the hearing sense, right? And effectively, these tools, more or less, are reading the screen and then helping navigate the screen. So they translate it, and then that helps the person go like, oh, I actually, tell the tool to click on home, tell the tool to fill in this form. I'm trying to pay my bill, and I, whatever. Tell this tool to like put my credit card number here, etc. Right? So even the accessibility tools are interacting with the website visually. And HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are largely visual. JavaScript would be, I guess, the least visual, but it's, for the sake of this example or this episode, it's the interactivity. It's, you click a button and then JavaScript will then make the whole web page flip around or something like that. So websites are largely visual, and visual things go to the browser, and the browser renders it, and it's rendering HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So, despite you having fancy plugins, packages, frameworks, libraries, those type of things, the browser can only interpret HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and that's how it renders, or that's how it displays the UI or the user interface. If you're using like a UI creation tool, like a framework or a plugin, one of those things, oftentimes it will actually compile your plugin, let's say, specific code, your proprietary code, let's say. It'll compile that down to vanilla code. It'll compile it down to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, I know there's some nuance there, like, obviously some JavaScript can be used on the back end. And if you're using a tool that works on both the front end and the back end, client side and server side, yeah, okay, some of your compiling, some of the commands are going to be on the server. But again, that's outside of the scope of this episode. I just want to be clear when I'm constantly reminding you that, because it sounds ridiculous being like, oh, JavaScript's only on the front end. It isn't, but just for the sake of this, it is. So, like, what is the sort of hot button issue here? The hot button issue here is that, basically anything that these fancy tools can do, these plugins, these frameworks can do, it can ultimately be done in vanilla tech. More or less, I mean, again, in terms of like the static page, you can more or less get it done with vanilla. And I think a lot of people they don't neither know that because they're new and they've jumped right into some sort of, framework or plugin, or they're like, hey, it's too difficult. And a really famous one is actually, Mike, like you'll remember this, is Ajax calls. Like back in the day, before we, Mike and I were even, knowing what React is, we weren't touching React, Angular, nothing. Like we weren't touching any framework plugin, nothing, not even a no-code tool. We were making sites quite literally in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for the most part. And then WordPress here and there, if we needed like a blog or something like that.
Like we didn't have any tools, like we didn't have any frameworks, we didn't have any like helpers. We were just working with pure, like to the metal of the browser at the time.
Right. And we were still making sites that more or less are functionally similar to today. And I think that was another episode that we covered as well, where we had a discussion where we were saying like, hey, like the actual website experience, short of web apps, because web apps are pretty advanced, the website experience of today, is a little nicer. Like there's like some nicer animations and things like that. But like, an Ajax call way back in the day was a serious pain. And so many websites would just, refresh, like you'd click something and it would like load another page, or it would refresh the page in order to change the data on the page without a refresh. And then jQuery kind of came around and it was like, everyone's like, yo, just use jQuery. And like you and I, Mike, were like super against that. Like we really didn't want to use that. We're like, no, like we want this thing to be as close to the metal, probably a bit of that embedded programming knowledge, to be honest. We want this thing to be as close to the metal as we can. We want this thing to be as performant as we can make it. And so we don't want to add jQuery in. Is it a small package? Yeah. Is it just a bit of different syntax? Yeah. Is it going to make Ajax calls a lot easier to read and do? 100%. The syntax for Ajax in jQuery is like 100 times simpler, easier to read and understand than it is in vanilla JS. But we just learned it in vanilla JS. We just sort of figured it out. So anything the fancy tools can do, in my point, more or less can be done with just vanilla tech, because the browser only understands vanilla tech when it's rendering pages. And so that jQuery is effectively being, compiled or translated or whatever down to vanilla JS and telling the browser to do that complicated syntax. But the human, meaning us, we had the abstraction layer if you're using jQuery to just do like, .ajax and then blah, 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 the rest of your stuff.
I think like during that time, it wasn't the better decision kind of to go with pure JS over jQuery as it is now. Like as JavaScript evolved, it actually went closer to jQuery than anything else in terms of there's now, fetch calls that are built into it. You don't need this XML HTTP request bullshit that we had to do back in the day for doing fetch calls. And that's what you were talking about, Matt, like that extremely convoluted way of calling APIs where Ajax was just like one little line that did everything for you was a pain in the ass. But when we were first learning, we had the advantage of not having the need for all these abstracted tools. And I feel like that was, we'll get into it in this episode probably a little bit more, but we got lucky in that sense because the capabilities that we needed to create were not overly difficult to do with vanilla tech. Like, yes, it was more difficult than jQuery or even like an Angular if it was a more complex thing, but definitely not super tough. Like the websites we were designing were websites that just needed to show information and maybe do a couple calls here, like back and forth to display data. It wasn't these crazy web apps that need to be created now by pretty much every developer. And because of that, we had a very good foundation in JavaScript right away. It was afforded to. Now, having said that, like I don't know if that is the case now. A developer coming up like from scratch now, does it make sense for them to just jump into pure JavaScript and only pure JavaScript for a long time? Or does it make more sense for them to go to like a framework? And I think that's what you're going to cover next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like it's the next part of the episode is going to like, kind of talk about like this sort of conflicting point. Like I'm literally going to like bring it to like an argument point where we're going to discuss, like, hey, there's a speed to this stuff, right? Like it took you and I a while back in the day to learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I mean, if I were to go and learn React today or like try to, gonna figure out more Svelte, because it's been a while since I've done it, Svelte or SvelteKit, it would take a long time and it would be like a huge time crunch, right? Like trying to get that done while you're building projects and stuff like that. So we're going to get into that in a second. But I want to just take a moment here to talk actually very quickly about my recent MagicMind experience. So MagicMind has hooked me up specifically with their subscription. So once a month, they've been sending me a 15 bottle case and it just comes to my door. I don't have to worry about it. I just basically have it. It comes to the door. I have it ready to go, and I will, use it up. I'll drink the good stuff, get it going. And just recently, I just went on a huge, I'm calling it a huge trip. It was like 4 or 5 days, but it was just like pretty expensive and like pretty packed full of stuff. Went to Toronto, went to a concert, went and kind of saw some sights there, had fancy dinners, went to a nice restaurant, went to another restaurant we go to all the time, stuff like that. Like we were just all over the place, all over Toronto, walking around, getting Ubered around and everything. And as one does, you're running around, you're trying to, get a good night's sleep. But one night you're back in the hotel at 4 a.m. The next night you're back at like 10 p.m. You're all over the place. Your sleeping's all over the place. And so you're going to be tired. But you don't want to miss the next thing just by being exhausted. And so what I was doing is every single time we went to go leave the hotel room, I would grab a MagicMind out of my luggage, quickly just, down that. And then I'm good for the evening. Most of our plans were evening plans or later afternoon plans. And I was just good for the evening after that. And again, I've mentioned this in the past, is for my personal experience. When I take a MagicMind, it helps me stay alert when I want to be alert, but it does not keep me awake. I was still able to, when I'm ready to hit the hay, when I'm ready to actually go to sleep, I'm able to actually, truthfully go to sleep. And the great part about this is having the subscription is really, really convenient. It allows me to not like think about it. So while I'm thinking about what clothes to bring, do I have my tickets? Do I have this and that? I don't need to really think about that. I don't need to think about MagicMind. I know that it's right where it's going to be. It's right in my fridge. It's just sitting there, ready to go. I'm packing my suitcase. I go in the fridge, I grab them, and that's it. And you don't have to get the 15 bottle case either. If you would prefer to have a MagicMind each and every day, you can do a 30 bottle case as well. You can get free shipping that comes with every single subscription. There's an easy, it's just super easy to just set it, forget it. You're going to have your MagicMind if you're going to take it every day, every other day, etc. And the great part is if you're like, man, I signed up for this subscription and like, I kind of don't want it anymore or something like that. There's a super easy cancellation process. There's no questions asked. And this can be done with a simple portal click or an SMS as well. You could just be like, hey, I don't want this anymore. follow their procedure. It's really, really simple. And there's a money back guarantee. There's a 100% money back guarantee for the first purchase, no questions asked, and no bottles expected in return. You're not going to have to purchase, a shipping label, ship it back in a special box or anything like that. You're not going to have to deal with that. And the thing here, since you're listening to this, is that we have a 20% off discount for everyone, including if you did the 3-bottle trial in the last episode. I think it was maybe 2 episodes ago now, as of listening to this. If you did that trial and you're like, hey man, I would like to take advantage of this 20% off discount, you absolutely can. So you can get 20% off or up to 20% off for both a one-time purchase, or if you choose a subscription, because the subscription is obviously just a better value, you can get up to 48% off if you choose that subscription. Get that, ease of delivery, get the free shipping, get the money back guarantee. Everything is great. Go and check it out if you're interested. Magic Mind, we have a unique link, magicmind.com/HTMLpod20. And again, you can get up to 48% off going to that link that I just said and using the code HTMLpod20 at checkout as well. Go check it out. It'll be in the show description, and full details will also be on htmlallthethings.com in the show notes for this episode. So aspiring junior developers are often told, hey, you got to learn the foundations. You got to learn this vanilla tech. You got to learn HTML. You got to learn CSS. You got to learn JavaScript. And this is where that point of contention comes in, because, and I mentioned this, vanilla tech, despite its name making it sound like it's kind of simple, takes a long time to learn because it can become very, very complex. And Mike, like you and I just last week, and we'll talk about this I have an example sort of section at the end of the episode, but just last week we were trying to get some vanilla stuff working, and, we were going to cut some features because it's freaking complicated. Like, it's not easy. Even with you and I working in sort of like a mentorship, I guess, or like at a partnership in, bringing in all the Google search results that we've had, bringing in ChatGPT, not simple. Just because it's vanilla tech does not mean it's simple. Because again, it can do most everything that the fancy tools can do. And here's where the argument comes in. It takes a long time to learn vanilla tech, but it also takes a long time to learn tooling, including the popular tooling. And popular tooling, the knowledge of it is often required by many employers. A big one is obviously React, right? React is going to take a long time to learn. There's like a whole other layer. There's like React, and then you could write regular JS with it, but no one does that. There's JSX. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but that's going to take a while. It's going to take a while for you to understand it. And even Svelte, where there's no JSX layer, and Svelte is kind of more human readable, at least in my mind, it's still like not super simple. Like even Mike, like you were saying when we were doing the full stack struggle series, one of the things that you and I discussed was how, it was going to take a few weeks for this to become muscle memory. Like, not only am I going to like lean hard on my vanilla JS knowledge constantly, but I was really struggling. I had to keep asking at the time I was using Copilot. I kept asking it questions like, hey, is this regular JS? Is this Svelte? Like, some stuff is obviously Svelte, but some stuff isn't. And like, am I actually learning new vanilla stuff here? And it's a big mess. And so the argument here, and a lot of it's to do with timing, but some of it's to do with just putting a bunch of knowledge in your head, is that maybe you should just go straight for a popular tool like React in your learning in order to get a job, right? I want to get a job quick. Well, you're not going to go and be like, well, I'm going to look up the history of jobs and like how the economy was formed and what's a resume and who wrote the first resume. Like, I mean, if you want to know that stuff, fantastic, but you don't need to know all that stuff to get a job. This is where the kind of point of contention, this is where it kind of becomes a bit of a hot button issue, because it's like, hey man, why don't we just go and immediately quickly learn React? Or you want to work at a place that needs Svelte? Why don't you just go and learn Svelte? So in our recent episode, Why is Web Development a Cluster F? Mike, you actually wrote that episode and you did an overview of the history of web development, and you went through obviously the past, worked your way all the way to modern times. And I'm not going to reiterate all that stuff. I'm going to put a link to that episode in the show notes if you care about it on htmlallthethings.com. But the overall impression I got was that we are going even deeper into abstraction layers. It just feels like there's more and more tooling. I mentioned this briefly already, but this, to me, and this is my opinion, it divides developers even further from foundational vanilla tech. So what does this mean? Does this mean that foundational tech is becoming less relevant in 2024? And is it that QBasic again? Like, is it just a learning tool? Is vanilla tech just a learning tool?
This is a good argument and a good conversation to have, I think, because we're in kind of this crossroads area of web development where I lean towards it. Yes, it kind of is just a learning tool. Like, yes, you can do serious development with JavaScript. 100%. Again, strictly front end we're talking about. You can do everything that React can do with JavaScript, but should you is another question. Like, in my opinion, no. Like, if these frameworks exist for a very good reason, and they're adopted by such a high percentage of companies and people and projects for a very good reason. They abstract complicated, messy things that JavaScript needs to do, that renders the UI in certain ways, that adds some accessibility stuff, that creates easier and more understandable code for doing complex UI manipulations. It abstracts all that away to help you write faster, better, more efficient code. 100%. Again, we had a previous guest, Chris Fernandi, on the show, and his argument is always going to be like, if you can do a vanilla JavaScript, do a vanilla JavaScript if you have the time and all that. And I get that argument, but the problem is that, like, if you're very good at vanilla JavaScript, you can write something that's more efficient, that's readable, that's faster, like performs better than a framework. The biggest issue is you have to be very good. You have to be a very good vanilla JavaScript developer to get that. Most developers, will struggle with that and will write worse code that will perform worse than React, that will perform worse than Svelte, and be unreadable. And yeah, it'll get the job done. But when they could have done the same thing in a framework that's designed for that specific purpose, 5 times, 10 times faster, and have it run better, it's hard to argue for going deep into learning every intricacy of vanilla JavaScript, right? Like, it is a difficult argument to make. In terms of, especially when you're like, okay, I need to get a job. I have a year where I can just do it in the evenings, or like I'm going through college, I'm going through university. Like, there's many different paths to web development. Let's talk about a more traditional path with just like, I'm going through university. You're going to get a lot of foundational knowledge in university in terms of coding. What is an algorithm? What mathematical stuff do you need to learn? What you're not going to get in university most of the time is like, what is JavaScript? You might get one little course on it or something. So a lot of times that falls on you to learn yourself if that's the path you want to take. And then your decision has to be, what am I doing this for? Am I doing this for creating a new framework? Am I doing this for writing a PhD thesis? Or more traditionally, am I doing this for getting a job after college or university? If the answer is I'm doing it to get a job, your time is extremely limited. You're doing all your studies. You're doing your crazy, data structures and algorithms stuff. You're doing all that. On top of that, you're required now pretty much to create a portfolio of projects outside of school to be able to land a job. So that time should be spent not screwing around with, learning every intricacy of vanilla JavaScript. It should be spent on learning the most popular tool to the best of your ability during that time. The most popular tool in most cases, not all, is probably going to be React. And so a deeper knowledge of React will take you further in a job hunt than a deep knowledge of vanilla JavaScript, period. And people can come at me for that. I don't know. I don't know if people disagree with that. Honestly, that seems like a pretty reasonable statement right now to make in the front-end developer world. But what inevitably comes out of that, unfortunately, is we're going to have abstracted layers on top of abstracted layers on top of abstracted layers, because we have developers that are being onboarded into web development without really understanding intricacies and limitations of JavaScript. And so they're going to lean too heavily on the tools, the abstraction layers like React or Svelte, and that could eventually make them create a tool that's going to be even abstract away more stuff on top of React that will abstract more stuff away, and then that leads to just poor performance, more difficult troubleshooting. Like, there is some negative outcomes from what's going on in the web development industry. But again, that shouldn't deter you from doing what's best for you right now, which is still learning the tool that's going to get you the job.
Well, with those comments, like we always preach, you should learn the foundational tech. Like, would you still say that you should, just not as, like, not a deep dive? And I think that may have always been our thing too, is like, I don't know if we've ever actually detailed it, to be honest, but we've never said, become an absolute master of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because it's just not going to happen. There's going to be some methods, for example, in JavaScript that you won't see for 2 years, and then all of a sudden it'll show up in, a forum, and you're like, what the heck does that do? Like, you're not going to remember everything.
Yeah, that is 100% the case. And what I suggest now is to learn very directed methods, very directed JavaScript that will help you with React. So stuff like array manipulation, 100% learn that. Stuff like, obviously, any sort of variable, like what closures, lifting, whatever it's called. Like, learn the basic concept of JavaScript as a language.
Oh, the hoisting.
Hoisting, thank you. Lifting, that's dumb.
I mean, hoisting, you were lifting.
Yeah, I'm terrible with terminology on the spot. But regardless, learn fundamental concepts of the language. Learn what you'll need to learn, like looping, obviously, is a very important one for frameworks specifically. Obviously, conditional statements, the fundamental building block of any language. Learn what an if statement, ternary statement, stuff like switch cases are and stuff like that. Do like a rapid boom, like go through the JavaScript side of things. It might, instead of going, building 3 big projects in vanilla JavaScript, maybe do some small little project that will teach you how to loop through and print stuff off into the console and, manipulate some arrays and stuff like that and print it off into the console logs. Don't go too deep because, again, it's your time that I'm worried about. The knowledge isn't useless for sure. Like if you go deep, if you have the infinite time and you go deep, it's still going to help you, but you'll notice that it doesn't help you as much as you think, especially when you're on the job hunt, especially when you're building with tools that abstract all that stuff away. It will help you in very intricate situations where the framework is outputting an error code that you don't understand, and sometimes knowing the fundamentals of JavaScript will help you read that error and solve it. It's an edge casey thing. It will happen probably at some point, but you'll know the deficiencies as you go there. And the other thing that you'll inherently do is, as you're learning React, you'll notice that you have some deficiencies in like the separation of React and JavaScript, and you'll go back and learn a little bit of JavaScript with the context of that in your mind as well. So it's like a back and forth kind of situation rather than like build this big foundational layer for months and months and months and then build the React on top of that. That is where I think we're shifting from, where it's like figure out JavaScript in a couple weeks and then move quickly on to React and then go back to JavaScript as you need it, because you'll have the foundation of React as well to kind of fall back on.
Let me ask you a question here. So like this just, maybe I'm wrong, but this feels like we're kind of like shifting a little bit away from recommending the 3 pillars all the time. Like I feel like some cracks have shown in that opinion over the last couple of years. Like we had an episode where we were talking about, if you're coming from, a desktop dev and you're like you make desktop apps and you come in, maybe you shouldn't learn the pillars. Maybe you should immediately use React. And I mean, do you think that like slowly but surely, like we're going to get into it. Like vanilla tech is still useful. I have examples of it literally still being used. And I quite literally used it last week for a pretty in-depth little thing, but little piece of functionality. But like, do you think that there comes maybe this is the question is, do you think that there's a day and maybe even sometime soon that we're just going to say, don't learn logic, like computer logic, conditional statements, ifs, arrays, things like that, iterating through things. That's very like syntax agnostic kind of information about programming. And do you think that we'll eventually just not recommend learning HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Do you ever see a day for that?
I don't see a day where we move away from recommending, at least it depends what we mean by learning. I think that's the definition that's changing. I think before, initially, when we first started this podcast, learning really meant like diving deep, learning HTML, like building out a couple websites, building out a couple projects or something like that would be, just a layout or here and there with HTML and CSS. Like that's learning HTML and CSS, building with it a few times, right? Learning with JavaScript, the same thing, like build a game and pure JavaScript, build like a little web app in pure JavaScript, build a to-do list in pure JavaScript. That was learning JavaScript to me. I think now the recommendation is coming away from maybe, again, building out multiple projects in pure JavaScript and moving towards just learning the fundamentals and jumping into React and building other projects in React. That's where the divergence is coming. And again, it does not come without its negatives. There is a give and take here. Like, because you're doing that, you're going to struggle in certain areas. But the way that React or Svelte, whatever framework you want to choose, is built, and the way that the tutorials are created, you'll still pick up some JavaScript along the way for sure. And you'll still become a decent JavaScript developer learning, because at the end of the day, it's just like extra functionality on top of JavaScript. And that in itself, that meld of JavaScript and a framework, and understanding a framework deeply, I think outweighs the need to understand JavaScript deeply because of how infrequently we use the front end functionalities of JavaScript these days. I do use inner HTML every once in a while, like .inner HTML, to replace stuff in very edge casey things. I have used that even as recent as like last week, but I can't remember the last time that I've like created an element. I can't remember the last time I've even like, DOM content loaded. Like, I haven't had to use DOM content loaded at all over the past couple years, right? Like that, I have had to target an element, like get element by ID here and there, but again, it's very edge casey. Specifically, like DOM manipulation stuff that were like core to our learnings early on about how to interact and how to like make it a website interactive. That stuff has all shifted to frameworks. And so like the abstracted layer is so much better than what we have with just vanilla JavaScript. Like, yeah, it's good to know that they exist, but to learn them fundamentally and to build projects with them just to then switch over to React and never use them again doesn't really make sense to me anymore. It's been a shift in the demands to the industry. It's been a shift in like how the industry is learning and how these frameworks are evolving and what they can do. That's kind of facilitated this change away from maybe like the foundational learn JavaScript for everything. I still believe that you should learn HTML and CSS, by the way. I think those two pillars remain the same. I think it's JavaScript that's becoming a little bit fuzzier with all the stuff that is around it.
Because JavaScript's really in depth. Like CSS is like, you have to like know the DOM flow, which comes from HTML. Like, to me anyway, it was like you write your HTML, you have no CSS, you're writing HTML for the first time, you kind of like see how it flows. Oh, it's this is up to down, left to right, etc. Like, you kind of like start getting a feel for like, okay, this is where it's going to naturally sit, and then I'm going to take my CSS and shove it over to the right because I don't want it there. That like remains, because like you'll even attest to this, I'm sure, Mike, is that there's always kind of been the meme of like, a back-end dev doesn't want to do CSS, but now it just seems like developers are the meme now, where it's like developers don't want to do CSS. And I feel like it's because many are not learning CSS just in general.
Yes. A lot of people aren't learning CSS because they're jumping straight into Tailwind or relying on like UI frameworks or UI like libraries that do all the styling for them. And again, that's another like trade-off of having this full stack thing that happened over the last few years where everyone's a full stack developer. Well, that means you have less time to work on the front end and less time to be good at laying out a website. So now you're just like, oh, I'm a web developer, but I don't really give a crap about the front end because I only work in the full stack side of it. It's such a weird, again, I stand by the title of the episode that we wrote a couple weeks ago with the web development as a cluster F, because it is. And like when you talk to people outside of web development about it, especially, they're like, what the is going on? Like, what is actually going on in your industry? Like, I don't understand a single word of what you just said. You're talking complete nonsense because this is what we do in our industry. Here's like 3 like paths you can take and you're good to go. Like, if you learn one of these paths deeply, you can do everything you need to do. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel every 30 seconds. Whereas web development, I can tell them about 15,000 different paths with 15,000 different branches, 15,000 different abstractions. And it all kind of like, to us, makes sense because we're like, well, we evolved from only 3. And then we're like, well, this makes forms better. This makes JavaScript a little bit better. This makes CSS a little bit better. To the point where it's just like, yeah, we've made everything a little bit better. But now it's like complete and utter chaos to explain and teach, especially. Like, again, it comes back to the junior developers that are getting into it. I feel so bad for them Because even though we've progressed so far in our tooling and our frameworks and JavaScript as a language, we've made it without hindsight, without looking back and being like, how are we going to teach this? And now, like, yeah, the issue here is that we can't. So now we're like, okay, well, people have to skip JavaScript. People have to skip this because, like, unless we want to get people to be learning web development for 40 years, they're going to have to like skip a bunch, and they're going to have to just jump into these frameworks without the core knowledge and hope that they can figure it out, kind of like jumping into the deep end. And if they can't, they can't. Like, they're out.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
That's the reality. If they can't figure it out, and if they can't do this crazy context switching back from framework to JavaScript, from JavaScript to framework in their learning path, GG, I guess, like that's it. That's what we're saying. That's what I'm saying in this episode. Like I'm not being the good guy here. I'm telling people that, like, yeah, this is probably the way you have to go because you're competing with everyone else that's doing it. Like, you're trying to get a job against everyone else that's going through this path. So, like, you being the best core JavaScript developer is probably not going to mean much to the people that are hiring React developers. It's unfortunate. Maybe it shouldn't be that case, but, you know, you have to compete in the game that you're playing, like, which sucks, but...
Yeah, it'd be like saying, I mean, like, if you really just think about this is like kind of a weird, I mean, this is not about necessarily development, but it is about technology. Is, you know, back in the day, it was like Windows was more or less a command prompt. And then, you know, now you had your GUI, or like computers were just like a command prompt more or less, right? And then a terminal, and then you have your GUI, and the GUI, you know, in the back end is running commands. Like, it's saving things, moving things around, running things, whatever. And then some of like the really niche things in Windows, it'll still say, yo, open up a command prompt, open up a PowerShell. And PowerShell is like an abstraction of the command prompt, you know, to an extent. Like, it's like there's many sort of things, if you really think about it, that abstract the tech that we use every day. I mean, we're talking about PWAs, which are in the browser, which are like apps that run on the website, and like they're not even OS apps. Like, they're not apps that have run on the OS. So the OS has all these abstractions that I just described, and then there's like an app, which is the browser that runs, and it has like sub apps inside of it. And you know what I mean? Like, there's like, is this abstracting abstractions and all like the sort of leaning tower of Pisa, I guess you could say, of like, oh my God, you know, we're built, you know, this tech goes on top of this tech. That's a bit sloppy, but whatever, we'll build it on top of this tech. And we mentioned in one of the episodes recently where I said like the top floor suite or something like that. This is from memory, but it's like the top floor suite is doing great. And all the levels underneath it is just a total disaster. Like, they're just all like worst rooms ever. And then once that suite gets a bit crusty, you don't get rid of the suite. You build another suite on top of it. So now it's doing great and all the stuff underneath is a disaster. But like, it just sort of seems like that's kind of how our tech works. Like, I feel like when we talk about this, especially since we have a podcast, we talk and think about a lot of this stuff. But I feel like a lot of this stuff, we're thinking in ideals. Like, we're thinking in a lot of ideal, like an infinite amount of time, which we're addressing in this episode, where it's like, hey, you know, you only have so much time to learn. We're thinking in absolutes, if you really think about it, right? Or not in absolutes, in like theoretical, I want to say theoretical perfection. That's not right. But do you understand what I'm trying to say, Mike? Where it's like, we're thinking in like, you know, it would be really nice if every single, like, I'll give it like a more like human example. If every single client had an infinite amount of time and no deadlines, like, that would be super nice. Build the thing, they're happy with what you do, right? Like, that's just like a utopian, perfect idea. Like, that's kind of how we view like web development to an extent, because we talk about it a lot. We talk about these like weird abstractions and like, hey, like, should I do this? Well, in my job, I do this, but I think you should be doing this because you're learning. But like, you know, you need a job. So like, do you do that? You know, like the human element kind of gets a little bit like muddied by us kind of thinking hard on the tech stacks and how things work. Whereas somebody just coming in goes like, yo, I want to build a website. And it's such a like loaded question, but to them, they're like, well, what do I do? And if we give them a loaded answer, if they're like entrepreneurial enough or like driven enough, they'll just go like, yeah, okay, man. And they'll ignore us and they'll just go do something, whether it's no code, whether it's code, whether it's this, whether it's that. They'll just go and choose something and then run with it. Right. So like, it's like, we're like too in it. Like we're like loaded up. We're too like of the web dev sphere to sometimes like see clearly, from the outside in almost, I guess you could say. But I do want to address in this episode, is vanilla tech just a learning tool? And of course, it's not a clear cut yes or no. It's the answer lies somewhere in between. And so I have a few instances where it's yes and a few instances where it's no. Even today, like even in 2024, I know we've been talking a bunch about like, like learn React because it's important for like job postings or like, more importantly, search the job postings in your area, the job postings that you would want to apply to and see what they require. Do they need Svelte? Do they need this? Do they need that? Do they need WordPress? Do they need PHP? Like what do they need? But, is vanilla tech just a learning tool? And the answer is yes for some people. And here's some examples. So if you're looking to get a job at a web dev agency, join a team of internal web developers at a larger company, then you'll most likely need specific popular tools like React. Maybe they'll be using like a very proprietary enterprise CMS solution or something. Just off the top of my head, Adobe's Magento is one of them, Typo 3, like an enterprise like CMS solution instead of like a WordPress is what I mean. And I think WordPress has some sort of iteration that's enterprise. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if you're looking more or less for, let's say, a traditional web development job, then yeah, maybe HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are more or less just learning tools. They may also be just learning tools for you if you are, interested in building your own online business and are hard set on a tech stack that doesn't involve writing vanilla. So like I just said, how like Mike and I are kind of like, we're in it. Like we talk a lot about different stacks and like what people do. And we deal with a lot of different clients. So like some people are on Shopify, some people are on Webflow, some people want full custom, some people need something that'll run on dial-up. So it's all over the place. So like, it's like we're too in it, right? The important thing is that my online business runs and continues to run. It's like, okay, so what you're actually interested in doing is, you're probably going to go on ChatGPT or Google. You're going to Google, hey, I want to build this type of online business. What are the, tech stacks if you're going to build it yourself? What are the tech stacks that you recommend? You're going to choose one, and then you're going to start to learn that. So then, yes, if you care about web dev at all, you may decide that you are going to use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as a stepping stone. But, in this situation, oftentimes you're not going to do that. You're just going to pick up bits and pieces of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript along the way, and you're going to go after that tech stack that was recommended to you in a blog post or by a friend or whomever else. Now, in these two situations that I just said, I just want to make a note that vanilla tech will only be used in like training, like if you use them at all. So many people will skip learning foundations to get started quickly. It's that timing thing, right? So like, let me just like clarify that. So it's like, if you're a person that's doing this, like you're not going to be like, I'm going to learn the foundations, just like Mike said, I'm going to learn the foundations and I'm going to learn every single one of the methods that JavaScript has. No, vanilla tech will be only used in training. And how quickly does like training go by when you're working at a company, right? So, it's a couple weeks and then you're probably not all that prepared, but you're kind of thrown into the deep end a little bit. You're going to learn faster on the job. You're going to learn a lot quicker on the job. And so you may just touch on vanilla tech. What's HTML? Maybe make a couple of quick pages. What's CSS? Maybe style those same pages. What's JS? Make a couple of buttons work on those pages. And then you're going to be like, okay, cool. And then you may go on to the thing you need, Svelte, React, etc. Now, is vanilla tech just a learning tool? There's the question again. And the answer is no for some. I mean, some of these apply to me. So no, vanilla tech is not just a learning tool if you're using a website builder solution. Let's say you run a Webflow agency. Let's say you are an agency that uses WordPress with a site builder and various other plugins that are more or less no code, right? You probably in these situations don't know how to code at all, or you just, recognize, oh, that gobbledygook is literally just, some code. But you decide, you know what? I'd like to extend my capabilities. I'd like to slightly enhance, slightly tweak the UIs that these tools are generating for me. Or I'd like to use, a CSS feature that, say, isn't possible with the Webflow controls, for example. And you can do that. So vanilla tech generally will plug into site builders quite well and easily, just because it is so close to the metal and runs on all browsers that I'm aware of. And so that's like a good way to go. For example, just last week, and I do have an example section of the episode, but just last week I built a quiz using a Webflow email form. So I was able to sort of, kind of hijack that form and make a quiz, an interactive quiz that people could do. And that was with vanilla HTML, a little bit, mostly CSS done by Webflow. So you're like learning how to integrate the two tools together, but a lot of JavaScript, a little bit of HTML, and then like, again, marrying it with the styles and some other features that Webflow offered, including their email form. Now, the thing here I want to say is that many web devs are probably already rolling your eyes. If you haven't already, tuned out, you might be like, you know what, like, the idea of a Webflow agency, like, come on, like, it's a no-code tool, you should be coding. This is a coding podcast, whatever. The thing is that some people need money quick. Learning Webflow is pretty quick, and there's already a community of people out there, just like how there's a community of people out there that are willing to support you or write guides or whatever if you're having trouble with React. So we really have to think about this in that way, where we have to say, hey, somebody may skip learning foundational tech in order to get to React quicker, to get a job quicker. Someone may draw the same conclusion, but may say, it's going to be faster for me to start a Webflow agency and start getting the money flowing now, or getting it flowing next week or next month, right? It's the same argument as let's learn frameworks first, get a job faster. It's like, I might learn Webflow first to get a job faster. It's not stopping them from down the road learning all the custom stuff that maybe you like. But again, like, there's a lot of different paths here. Like, it is a cluster F, like Mike said. It is a bit of a mess, and like, no code does fall into this. And I use it professionally. I get paid to do things on Webflow, plus the custom enhancements and capability adding that I add to the platform with custom code. And oftentimes it's vanilla custom code. Also, is vanilla tech just a learning tool? No, it isn't if you're trying to be versatile. So learning foundational tech allows you to learn programming logic and syntax that works on virtually any website solution today. And when I say that, it's not just limited to WordPress and Webflow. If you go on to, a shared hosting service, like maybe your first site, which probably will be, is just, a few dollars a month, little shared hosting thing, you're just getting, just basic lamp stack, cPanel. Oftentimes in that cPanel, there's like apps in there that are like, use our website builder, use our app builder, use this and that, right? If you use any of those website builders and app builders, or I guess not app builders, but website builders, web page builders, more or less, like, if you want to make any specific changes, you're going to have to do a bit of custom code, and you're going to have to be pretty like versatile, right? So having that versatility is great, very similar to my previous point. However, maybe you're trying to be really versatile. So sometimes you want to use those website builders, sometimes you want to use a no-code tool, but sometimes you want to use React. So you are a custom code person, but you're in the speed game. You're going fast. You're like, I want to learn quick. I want to build quick. I want to build a lot. I want to do a lot of different things. So sometimes you are going to go for that. You're going to go for Wix today. You're going to go for Wix Studio. Tomorrow you're going to go for Webflow. The next week you're going to go over there. The next week you're going to go over here. Like, you're going to be all over the place. You need to be versatile. And so having foundational knowledge, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, it is easier to typically, anyway, in our experience, it's easier to transition between frameworks. It's easier to transition between tools. And it's easier to know generally what you can add and what you can't. Like I said, I just built that quiz functionality for Webflow. Like, I was able to do that because I knew, I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to be able to like do this with a form, blah, 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 and figured all that stuff out. Like, that's pretty versatile. And like, so if you are a person that says, I want to be all over the place, I want to be building stuff quick, fast, all over the place, boom, this is a reason why you should actually use and learn vanilla tech. And it's not just a learning tool for you.
Interestingly, we said we weren't going to talk about the backend, and that's fair. But interestingly, the argument sort of falls apart when you bring in the backend in terms of full stack apps. And I'll explain. So a lot of JavaScript on the front end is pretty canned. So like, there's certain patterns that you would use to, create an element, or there's certain patterns you would use to send a request. And there's certain patterns that you would use. Like, I don't want to say it's like limited or anything like that, or easy. It's definitely not that, but it is fairly like constrained because you can only do so much on the front end. You can't access the file explorer. You can't access like it's purposely made to be kind of a sandbox where without much access to external functionalities for security purposes. And because of that, the limitations allow for some simpler logic, simpler code to the point where it's not like crazy to like learn a bunch of little things in JavaScript on the front end to know them from a foundational method in a couple weeks, to like understand a couple, like, you know, the intricacies of front end JavaScript. Where it kind of falls apart, though, is if you want to be a full stack developer, which is apparently everyone now, according to the 2024 Stack Overflow survey. There's barely any front end developers out there, according to the survey. If you want to be that full stack developer, you need to know JavaScript, like for the JavaScript full stack frameworks. And I say these with air quotes because you have, you know, Svelte with Svelte Kit. That's the meta framework that brings in Node.js into Svelte. You have Next.js, which is the Node.js on top of React. You have Astro, again, same thing with anything really. You have Solid, like there's like a million different frameworks that bring in Node.js, allowing you to write backend functions, usually serverless. And those can be infinitely complex. And those seriously require very significant foundational programming and JavaScript language knowledge. To the point where you can't just skip them. You can't just skip JavaScript at that point and not understand it. Like, how does asynchronous development work in JavaScript with promises, with async awaits? That's foundational knowledge you absolutely must have to be able to use a framework like Next.js, period. Right? Like, there's certain things you can't skip that you could from a front-end perspective. So, like, it's not really just a learning tool in a lot of different ways. Again, when you bring in the backend, I know we didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to kind of at least mention it right now.
Oh, no, mention it all you need. Like, I just wanted to make sure that, like, the stuff I was saying was, like, I'm letting people know that I'm aware the JavaScript can run on the backend, but I was just talking from the perspective of someone that goes, like, I want to build a site. How do I do so in the most basic way? Boom, this is what it is, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's still, like, the argument still holds up on the front end side for sure. Like, I would say that whatever we said before with, like, skipping JavaScript for the most part and going straight into React can be beneficial. But again, if you're looking at the job breakdowns now, like React is still really high, but Next.js is creeping up, which is, again, the meta framework for React. And other frameworks like Nuxt.js for Vue.js, like all those frameworks are creeping up because having your entire app's code base in one framework, including the backend and the front end, is pretty beneficial in some situations. And so that's why this, like, the speed of which you can develop, knowing like JavaScript really well and knowing a front end framework like React can really accelerate a project from like 0 to MVP. And that's where these frameworks like thrive, is creating MVPs. And that's why everyone goes crazy for these frameworks, because like you can hire a team of 3 developers and have an MVP in a few months. Whereas before it was a little bit more difficult with like spinning up whole separate backend servers, whole separate front end servers, usually sometimes 2 different teams, a lot of context switching. Like, again, into that perspective, it's definitely not a learning tool. Like, it is the tool. Like, JavaScript is the tool in those situations. Like, you need to know it in depthly. Yeah, I've been brushing it off a little bit in these episodes of like is web development, a cluster F and this one. But the reality is that like, can you really go away from not learning it? It'd be difficult unless you're going into like backend languages, and then you would have to learn like PHP or Python or whatever other backend language you choose. Go just as in depthly as you would have to learn JavaScript at that point to understand how to communicate with the client and the server and stuff like that in an efficient way with databases. I hope that I didn't confuse people, but I did want to at least add that in here because it is, again, according to that survey that we talked about in the last week's episode or the episode before that, very, very popular full stack development. So,
well, this is a testament to like how confusing web development can be. Like, it's all over the dang place. Like, I mean, I'm working professionally in the space and like I barely know Svelte. I know no React. I know like generally what's going on. It's like Mike and I are 2 sides of the coin, right? Like, I'm doing a lot of no code stuff. And, you know, a lot of that is because A, that's my knowledge, but B, it's like, could I go and learn Svelte and stuff like that? Yes, I could. But like, we're getting paid to do this other stuff, like working with small to medium business clients. Like, we got paid just like last week helping somebody just set up a Shopify. Like, there wasn't even any custom code or anything. It's like, just having that knowledge is useful, right? Like, and that's a website. Like, I know it's e-commerce and it's just, well, it's just this. Yeah, but I just got paid, like it's just one of those things. It's all over the place. Like, this industry is so, I don't know if I want to say diverse, but it's everywhere. Like, it's all over the dang place. Like, it's, left, right, up, down, center. Like, it seems to be kind of everywhere. And, some people love that. Some people hate that. Some people want things a little more stable. Some people want, solutions to be more specific. And I just don't think you're going to get that here. Like, I'll give an example. Like, I was trying to get like Font Awesome free. Like, I was just trying to get some icons working in one of the full stack struggles, I think. And like, I looked it up and it's like, oh, you could do an NPM package. And I was like, well, isn't it just like one little like HTML tag? Like, can't I just like include this? I was just pulling from their CDN, and like, I could have installed a whole NPM package that I have no idea what the dependencies are. I have no idea about all this other stuff. And I'm not saying it's a bad deal or it's a bad idea. To me, it's like, okay, like, we're adding this abstraction layer. Like, why would we do that? But then it's like, yeah, but maybe having the HTML thing is too simple. Like, if we were to update the package, would the package update the Font Awesome version? I know that's one very small example, but for the sake of an audio show, I'm not going to get into like, going through a bunch of syntax and stuff to give an example. There's so many ways to tackle a problem. Like, using WordPress is a way. Some people will roll their eyes and say that's stupid. Well, I mean, if you're going to get paid to do that and your goal is to get paid, I mean, you're still making a site, you're still providing a service. It's still a skill that many people don't have. And, many people obviously do, because WordPress is rather large. The community is rather large. I think the sort of potential confusion there, Mike, is just more or less because the industry is all over the place. And we could talk to death, and we probably have, on the show several times, about like, it's all over the dang place. And maybe that's why maybe that's why tutorials, we are at tutorials too, but our best ranking tutorials are ones that are specific situations. Like, people block all that noise out, or they're unaware of it. And they go, how do I center text in CSS? Like, they don't care whether it's an NPM pack, like, that's it. How do I center text? And those are our best, like, SEO articles, SEO performing, when we literally type in a common situation that people have and like how to get out of it, or how to integrate it, how to fix it, how to do it, those type of things. Meanwhile, if we were to write an article about all the things I talked about in the how to center text CSS article, if we were to take that out of that, like, don't call it that, and we call it like something more generic, like an MDN article is a good example, where it's almost like a data sheet on various properties. So let's say we used 4 or 5 properties in that how to center text article. And I decided, okay, like, I don't want it named that anymore. I'm going to actually like do more of an MDN article where I'm just going to take those specific properties, put them in, and name it like a very generic name. Nothing against the MDN. We need those things because I use them all the time. But many sort of like people that are just sort of trying to get something done in the moment are not going to land on the MDN article. They're going to land on a blog post that's tuned to their specific situation, because they don't have that noise where it's like, we're like, hey, what is this property? I'm going to copy and paste this from a Stack Overflow. What is this property? And like, what else does it do? So then we're going to end up in the MDN, where someone else is going to come to me. They're going to be like, well, Matt says to center text vertically like this. So I'm just going to copy that, put it in there. Oh, my text is centered. Cool. And that's the end of it, right? Like, that's the end of their interaction with CSS for the day. There's so many just like places to write code, do things, build sites, methods of learning. Like, are you just trying to build a project? It's too diverse to account for everything. Now, I do want to move on to the final section of the episode here, which is vanilla tech examples in 2024. So things that, like, you could really actually be seriously hired to do. I'll go like, pretty quick on these, like do a deep dive into them, but websites that need to be very performant. So Mike and I already mentioned that if you're using HTML and CSS and JavaScript, it's very close to the metal, if you will. It's very, 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 very performant. And so we've had projects in the past, which we've mentioned in the past, where we've done things where it's like, hey, we have a bad network connection. We have like dial-up speeds, they're in a remote area, whatever, old device. We have dial-up speeds. We need something that should be performant. We can't deal with, ads loading in for 45 minutes and our data, bandwidth limits or whatever being hit. So if you work in a place that needs an extremely performant website, or even basic web app that can be mostly client-side, HTML, CSS, and JS, that is something that you can absolutely be hired for in 2024, because websites are like they're all over the place, right? Like, I've seen websites be used in conjunction with a scanner, an optical scanner for like scanning barcodes. So websites aren't always just marketing sites or blog posts. And the next one here is manipulating and extending no code. So we already talked about this, but I'll give a specific example. So I built a quiz using a Webflow email form. I used the Webflow styling, and then I used quite a lot of custom JS and a touch of custom HTML. And I was able to basically take an email form and make it so that it didn't send emails. It like showed specific questions. You click, next back, or rather next to go to the next question, previous go to the previous question. I actually had like custom radio buttons that I couldn't do with Webflow because it messed with my JS. So I had to make my own custom sort of system that way. Like a ton of stuff. There's a lot of stuff, and it was all either Webflow or vanilla. And like, it was a paid job. Like, let's just say that, right? I'm not going to give away customer names and stuff, but it was a paid gig, and like, I got good feedback on it. So it's not like, a lot of clients aren't going to be like, hey, why is that JS? Like, they don't even know. A lot of them aren't going to know what that is. And even if they do know, they're not going to care. But Mike, so you and I had a meeting about this. I just wanted to add something. And this is like a thing that is not vanilla. I want to be clear. But remember how earlier in the episode, we were mentioning how Ajax, in vanilla is kind of a pain. And, jQuery kind of came in and cleaned it up. You and I were having a meeting because I was stuck on a small part of this quiz. And, we were going to try to work through it. And we came up with the solution to a few things, but there was a couple of things that you were just like, maybe we should just leave this because it's going to be super complex and really annoying. And you said, this is all handled by something. Like, what is that something?
Yeah, so this specifically refers to adding accessibility to like custom forms, right? Like, and by custom forms, I mean, HTML gives you a bunch of inputs, like select boxes, radio buttons, input boxes, all that. They give you all that. The problem is that a lot of them aren't very customizable. And so you'll be able to customize certain things. You won't be able to customize other things. You'll be able to customize like colors, but you won't be able to customize shapes, et cetera, et cetera. There's different limitations for different input boxes. It's kind of all over the place. And so for frameworks, a lot of times people will create UI libraries, usually starting out with forms, where they'll put like a facade on top of an existing like drop-down menu, for instance, and the facade will be the thing that actually is displayed, but the existing drop-down menu will remain as the functionality. And this thing, like where you create the facade that literally sits on top of the UI, where the actual real select menu, the real drop-down menu is hidden, isn't inherently going to be accessible. So yes, you can create it. Yes, you can put it on top of there. It in itself, like creating it in itself, is a pain in the butt. But then on top of that, making it accessible is an extra challenge because, again, accessibility, like all the ARIA labels, all the tab indexes, all of that is done for you with HTML forms. As soon as you start editing that, that goes away. And you have to do it yourself manually, which you can leave out a tab index. You can forget an ARIA label. You forget extra, etc. The screen readers will break. The tab indexing will break. People won't be able to navigate using a keyboard. A bunch of different effects can happen if you create your own facades every single time. 100%. What libraries like ShadCN, I think that's the one you were referring to, Matt, that we were talking about, do is that they abstract all that away. They give you the kind of headless facades that look pretty much the same as the default HTML drop-down menus and any forms. But what they allow you to do is style them however you want. And so they'll do all the functionality. They'll do the basic styling initially to make them look like forms. But what they'll do on top of that is they'll add all the accessibility to this facade. And for you, you're pretty much using it just like you would use a regular input box. But it automatically adds in all the things and lets you fully customize it however the heck you want. So it's kind of a really cool, again, abstraction on top of vanilla, obviously. And usually, again, there's ShadCN is a really, really popular one that's kind of spread it up because it's very customizable. It's not an NPM package. All you need to do is copy over the code from like literally their GitHub and put it into your library of components. Like it doesn't have many dependencies is the really cool thing about it. And it gives you all the functionality that you would need for a customizable object. And they don't just have forms. They have drop popovers. They have alert boxes. They have notifications. They have a million different things, and they make creating really customizable UIs really easy for accessibility and for just shareability of code and really clean code as well. Like you don't have to worry about recreating the wheel every single time. You just import this as a component. But that's outside. Again, this is outside of vanilla. I just wanted to kind of bring up an example of where maybe vanilla isn't the greatest.
It's a good point because it's a prime example of how jQuery was abstracting the Ajax, where you just do like a .ajax method, I believe it was. It's been a long time since I've used it, but just like a .ajax method is a lot easier than all that like XML HTTP requests or whatever the heck they were back in the day. Like it was a real pain. And like, you know, this was a one-to-one thing where that's why I wanted to mention it is, you know, I did all this stuff, but I had to like account for all that stuff, had ARIA labels, have this and that. And I guarantee it's not even perfect, right? I'm not going to remember every single accessibility thing. The software I use to scan hasn't complained, so that's good. But, you know, there's probably something that could be done better, and having, you know, sort of a specialist in the area like the Shad CN, like you mentioned, which is not vanilla, but it's an example of an abstraction that would have saved me a lot of time if it were compatible in this particular case. I guess another example of vanilla tech examples apparently in 2024 is adjusting content in a CMS when the visual editor doesn't get it quite right. Now, this happens more often than you think. Rich text editing solutions are great, but they mess up a lot. A link will have a stupid space and it won't delete it. You're trying to backspace it, it deletes the whole link. It's a mess, right? So it'll either mess up your content slightly or just straight up incorrectly represent the content entirely. So almost always there's a little code editor button, or like a, you know, go look at the HTML or edit the HTML button. And you can go into that code editor, and if you know HTML and inline CSS, usually inline styling, you know that stuff. Usually you can go in there, boom, 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 clean it up, go back into the visual mode, and it'll look perfect. So this is another example where this is something where if you have quick, you know, and quick vanilla knowledge, you can fix up some of these blog posts. The amount of times I've seen a blog post, and I'm sure I have some of them too, but the amount of times I've seen a blog post messed up just a little bit because, you know, someone didn't either know they could go into the code editor or didn't know what the code editor did. And they just had to leave like a stupid thing where they had like 4 spaces after a link because for some reason all the lines underneath it became a hyperlink, and big mess because the visual editor just messes up. Super common, even in 2024, super common. Literally did it earlier today. Third one here, or fourth one, I suppose, is CSS adjustments to WordPress themes. So you can make adjustments for little things, colors, margins, touch up responsivity. If there's a bug in the theme that hasn't been patched yet, messing up the responsivity, you can go in there and change some things. And you can do that with just literally going into the additional, I think it's a text area in WordPress that's for additional CSS. You go in there and type your CSS, and you don't need to worry about having a UI control for it. You don't need to have a toggle that the plugin or the theme maker has done for you. If there's like a certain color on the top that for some reason doesn't have a control that you can change it, you could change that with CSS with a little bit of custom CSS. So doing some CSS adjustments to WordPress themes is great. And the reason why I mention this is you're thinking like, you know, this isn't exactly like job worthy. Not necessarily. However, if you're hired to manage a WordPress site and you're able to do little tweaks here and there that are beyond the capabilities of the other staff around you, or if you're literally working for a WordPress agency and you just want to start getting acquainted with extending the capabilities of something like a WordPress, then little things like this is a great stepping stone to get started. And you're, again, on the job, like I said, so it is a bit of a professional skill, or it is a professional skill. And also, this is another WordPress one. This is the final one. Add functionality for free. So don't install another WordPress plugin, you know, for something simple. You might just need a little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, a little bit of JavaScript, whatever it is, just even a combination of those, obviously, right? That'll usually do the trick. If it's something small you want to add, instead of being like, I need another plugin, I need another plugin, I need another plugin, right? So for example, I've achieved on an older version of Elementor Pro, because things have changed, but on an older version of Elementor Pro about a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I achieved conditional visibility without a conditional visibility plugin by just using custom attributes in the CSS. And then I had some tailored CSS that would read those and then change things off and on, depending on some logic that I had with ACF, which is Advanced Custom Fields. So instead of having, you know, you have WordPress, which is the platform, I won't consider that. So WordPress, but you had Elementor Pro, there's a plugin, ACF, there's a plugin, and then also a conditional visibility plugin. I've cut down the plugin count by a third in that particular in that particular case. So, I mean, extrapolate that to an absolute ton of different plugins, and also think about how many plugins hide their most valuable features behind a paywall. How many subscriptions are you not paying now? So having the ability to add a little bit of functionality for free, especially if it's your custom blog and you're going to understand your own code, it doesn't have to be super elegant, but it's just going to be perfect for the user. It's just going to be a little weird for you to edit. You don't want to pay another $40 a year. You don't want to pay another $10 a month. That's pretty good. And again, if you're working at a place that you're the content editor and you can do a little bit extra, maybe you can get a raise. Maybe you can do a little extra at your job. Maybe you're the superstar there now, because people are hired just to be WordPress content editors. So, and then maybe you won't have to bug the dev team. Maybe you can do a little quick fix before they push an official patch or something like that. Pretty helpful being able to extend these pretty powerful platforms like WordPress, Wix, Webflow, all that type of stuff. But I think that's it. I've talked my own ear off. My throat hurts. Mike, do you have anything else to add to this episode?
Learn JavaScript. No, but seriously, I think a lot of people shit on JavaScript. For whatever reason, I get it. Like, I get the JavaScript ecosystem is a chaotic cluster F. But at the end of the day, the core languages of the web get the job done pretty damn well. And if you're good at them, you're probably going to be okay. It's a little bit like, at a left field, I guess, for this episode. But I feel like, if you're a good programmer, it doesn't matter. If you're a good programmer, you can learn JavaScript, you can learn Python, and then jump into React, learn React really quickly and get through it.
Well, I've talked to programmers, Mike, I'm sure you have too, where they don't even ask me what syntax I'm using. Like, they'll be like, what are you building? I'll be like, a site. They're like, cool. And then they just ask about the project, and I'll be like, oh, I'm using JavaScript. Like, that doesn't matter. Like, they just don't care about the language.
And they shouldn't. And then, like, to get a job, you go through the rigmarole, you do all the things, and then once you have a job and you're in the job for a while, it just doesn't matter anymore. You just kind of learn what's best for you at that exact moment in time to solve the problem that you need to solve at that moment in time, and you move on. And all these conversations become pretty moot. It's still good to have, again, for people coming into the industry, but as you're in the industry, JavaScript is great. Like, it can do everything you need it to do. And it, learning it in depth is probably going to benefit you, unless you're trying to get a job. I don't know what else to say. Good luck.
Web development is weird, and good luck. Well, I mean, that concludes this episode. I was going to say I'm going to write that blog post you told me, Mike, but I don't even remember what it was now. It was like an hour and a half ago or 2 hours ago at this point, I feel like. So that's it. We'll roll back the tape, and we'll figure that out. Maybe I'll write something up. But if you want to support episodes like this, remember that we are on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML all the things. Check out the tiers and give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons, Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And just a reminder, if you want to have the convenience of having some delicious and helpful Magic Mind delivered right to your door without you even thinking about it, you can do that with one of their subscriptions, 15 bottle cases or 30 bottle cases, depending on how much you're going to be using your Magic Mind, how much you're going to need it, want it, crave it, whatever. You can get up to 48% off with our link, magicmind.com/HTMLpod20, and our code, HTMLpod20. That information with more details will be on htmlallthethings.com in the show notes, and I'll also include the link and the code in the show description for quick access in compatible podcast apps. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on htmlallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show, and we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings, and we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things, and on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.